Welcome, everyone. This is the right place for the talk this evening by Gal Gordon. We're going to give it a few minutes to just let everyone log on, but we'll get started by around 5 after 6. Welcome. I'm seeing a few more people join. Just want to let you know you're in the right spot for the talk tonight, but we are going to give it until around 6:05, just to let people trickle on to the Zoom. Welcome, everyone. Still seeing a few more people logging on, so we're gonna wait a little bit longer before we get started, but we'll get started by 6:05 at the latest. Number's been chilling out for the last minute or so. Oh, and it's 6:05, so I think we'll get started this evening. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Amy Kaplan-Medvik, and I am the Director of Educational Programming here at Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. For those who are new, Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, managed by the Women's Exchange, preserves 2 19th century New Orleans homes, and through their architecture, collections, and history, inspires discourse about our collective past and its relevance to our present and future. We invite you to come visit us the next time you're in the French Quarter. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Louisiana native YaYa Gordon is a professional historian and genealogist who specializes in interpreting antebellum history, genetic genealogy, descendant group research, and conducting oral history interviews, I should say. Gordon is a contributing writer and researcher for Array's newest learning companion, the Queen Sugar 101 Learning Companion, which is based on the critically acclaimed own Oprah Winfrey Network series Queen Sugar, created by filmmaker Ava DuVernay. Gordon currently serves as a researcher for the National Trust for Historic Preservation and serves as the president of the Bonnet Carré Historical Center / 1811 Kidori House. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from Southern University and A&M College at Baton Rouge, a Master of Arts in Museum Studies from Southern University, New Orleans, and is a PhD candidate in higher education at Jackson State University. She serves as a charter member and current president of the Louisiana chapter of Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, and is the current vice president of genealogy for the AAHGS National Chapter. Tonight's lecture marks and celebrates the launch of our own museum's database of enslaved individuals, a free online resource with information about each of the enslaved persons in our records at the Hermann-Grima House in New Orleans. For anyone who is interested in exploring the database, you can find it up on our website, hgghh.org. Gordon's talk, entitled "Like All Servants of That Illustrious Family, Conflicts of Uncovering and Rediscovering Those Deemed Notable Slaves," explores the possibilities of the field of African-American genealogical research, showcasing just how vital the work of digitization and broadening archival access really is. As Gordon will delineate in her talk, while many African-Americans in the South have ties to Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia due to slavery, forgotten yet recovered histories can lead to astonishing finds. Join us as we discuss the enslavement, freedom, and descendants of enslaved people willed and sold to Louisiana from presidential-related families. Please give a warm welcome to YaYa Gordon.
Good evening, and thank you, Dr. Medvick. I greatly appreciate that introduction. And I greatly appreciate everyone for being on this presentation tonight. It means everything. And I want to quickly just go back to something that Dr. Medvick mentioned about creating a database. These individuals, a few of these individuals that I'm going to be speaking about tonight, it would be such an honor for them to be added to a database that even though they do not have ties to Hermann-Grima, they are extremely important from Orleans Parish, but also a surrounding a parish nearby. And so their stories matter. And so I want to make sure that they are never lost to history. So starting off with this project, when I first received a call, a message from one of my mentors and colleagues, Ms. Laura Van Kilser, Van House, she asked if I could assist with locating persons that were sold to Louisiana from a family that was from Fairfax, Virginia. And this was the Lawrence Lewis family. And for the past year or so, I've been working diligently on this project to uncover as many individuals that I possibly can, their descendants, and learn more about their life stories, but also make some connections and family connections between those who are still here in Louisiana to those persons who they may be related to in the Maryland, Virginia, and DC area. And so tonight I'm going to provide a little bit of information about some of those discoveries, but you'll be seeing the full publishing in the future as the project is going to be coming to an end very, very soon. So without further ado, I'm going to start sharing my screen and get right into the presentation. Okay. As mentioned, the Lawrence Lewis family, there is a lot of connections that are going to go back to George and Martha Washington, or Martha Dandridge and George Washington. They're first going to start off, I'm going to give you a little bit of background of how Lawrence Lewis and his wife are interrelated to the Washington family. Lawrence Lewis was the nephew of George Washington, and his wife, Eleanor Nellie Parke Custis, was the granddaughter of Martha Dandridge, who later became the wife of President George Washington. So this right here gives a little bit of overview of how these connections actually go into play. I don't want to spend too much time on these actual families because there's a plethora of information already out about these families, and I am not a researcher of the Washington or even the Custis family, and so I'll leave that to other researchers to actually do. But this just gives a background of the relations and how these individuals were willed and tied to certain persons from in Louisiana. The next slide you see here is, of course, of Lawrence Lewis and his wife, Eleanor Nellie Parke Custis. Now, so as said, these persons are both interrelated to George Washington and to George Washington's wife. There were two daughters that were listed in the will of Lawrence Lewis, Frances Parke Lewis and Mary Eliza Angela Lewis. Frances married Edward George Washington Butler, and her sister married Charles McGill Conrad. So those persons, when they were, those persons willed to those individuals, they were under the individual ownership, but still community ownership of between the wives and the husbands. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with a will or a succession, will and succession, it provides information on the property of an individual, of a deceased individual, and is located in various government repositories. And it provides information about, say, the enslaved community, any movables, which included the enslaved persons, any properties of the decedent at the time of their death. And inside of those wills and successions, those enslaved persons would be appraised according to their craft, their skill, their gender, their health, their ability to have children, their temperament, and other identifying factors. Now, the succession record also discloses any debts that a person owes. So if a person was in debt to someone, then they may sell off an enslaved person to pay for that debt, or they're going to divide those individuals up amongst their children or their other heirs. So many times I've seen in succession records, when the sale of the property, there are many individuals who are associated with the property that are enslaved and saying that they are attached to the plantation or attached to the property. So they're being sold alongside with the actual plantation itself. Now, on March 1st, 1839, Lawrence Lewis of Fairfax, Virginia, submits his signed will to the courts. And in this will, he provides his daughter, Frances Parke Butler, wife of General Edward George Washington Butler, the right to 15 enslaved persons given to her by her mother, and their increase meaning their children. In the same document, he also provides the individuals to, it's actually 9 individuals to his daughter, Mary Eliza Angela Conrad. She's the wife of attorney Charles McGill Conrad. Their ages and their relations to each other are not provided in the will at all. They're only listed by name, and they're listed out of order. And I can tell that they're out of order because of subsequent information that is provided that I was able to locate the individuals on. So group 1. These are the names of the enslaved persons who were willed to Frances Parke Lewis. You have Nellie, Dennis, Tom, George, Jane, Mary, Frances, John, which is usually called John Button, and Lucinda. Now for Lucinda, she has been spoken about in previous records from the Lewis family. And she's also been written about several times in correspondence from Edward George Washington Butler throughout his family. This is a copy of a portion of what the will actually states. And as you can see, you'll see the enslaved persons' names on the second to last row on the bottom. Now, uncovering these individuals, it was a task that was a very enlightening one. As you saw, the individuals who were enslaved did not have surnames, ages, or anything associated with them on the actual will. However, after careful research and looking through ship manifests, I realized that these people had to get to Louisiana some kind of way. And they had to, of course, most likely come by boat and come by ship. And so that is when I started looking for some of the names that mirror those that are in the will, and was able to uncover that these individuals arrived in November the 6th, 1835. Now that's actually before the will was provided. So there is some individuals that are listed in the ship manifest that are not on the will, and vice versa. But on the bottom left, you'll see the individuals there listed by their names. And with that list, they're actually listed in order. And so you can start to pull together and piece together a little bit of family groups. I have not been able to uncover an announcement from New Orleans or Orleans Parish that shows when the boat arrived and what happened after, or how long they were at the port in New Orleans, but there were announcements in other cities such as New York, but also Alexandria, Virginia, that provides the information on these enslaved people. And there is a typo there. It's actually supposed to be 1836. Now, these are some of the names for the persons that are listed in the will for that were willed to Francis. You'll see John Button again, Nellie. Now Nellie is Nellie Parker. You have Thomas, who is Tom Parker, Calvert Parker, Jane, Mary, and Francis. And you also see their ages, male or female, and also their height of these individuals and their complexion, their tone, their skin tone. And that information was documented on the ship. Now, I would like to say that one of the parts of research that goes along with these individuals is there are so many more individuals that were on this ship outside of just these persons. You can already see that this is going into 163 and counting. There were 174 people on this particular boat. Again, these are the names of the persons. Now, Lucinda is, again, mentioned very often in some of the correspondence by the Lewis family. It was discovered in one of the writings that she did pass away in 1853. So it's not a lot of information that was being able to be located about Lucinda much long after they arrived. So Louisiana is down south. That is a plantation paradise. We are considered still plantation country here. And when I mean plantation, a lot of farmland, especially in the deep south. And so here are images just showing what some of the plantation grounds look like. If you've never had an opportunity to look at Norman's chart of the lower Mississippi River, you absolutely have to do so, especially if you're researching in Louisiana and you're researching plantation history. And I like to inform people a lot, when they're researching these plantations, you have to look for the owners' names, as opposed to actual plantation names, because many times some of them didn't have plantation names. They had the owners' names, and those names could change as ownership could change as well. But these are just two snippets of what Iberville Parish looks like. And this is from 1858, but also what Orleans Parish looked like at that time. Of course, this is not all of the plantations, but as you can see, every area is completely covered with plantation grounds. And so for those persons to be sold down to Louisiana, they were coming to a place where the life expectancy was going to be very, very low for them. And because in Iberville Parish, speaking of, that is where Butler and his family were located, on Dunboyne Plantation. And that is, Iberville Parish is considered one of the most harshest sugarcane parishes in Louisiana. It is all sugarcane. That is what they grow there. And sugarcane is a very harsh crop to grow. So the life expectancy was very low. The climate, the weather, the diseases, and just the dangers of being on this type of plantation. It is a wonder how many of them did travel from Fairfax, Virginia, all the way down here and still continue to survive, as I later find.
And as you can see, the sugarcane right now is growing up really, really tall. It can grow typically 6 to 8 feet tall, sometimes 12 feet tall, depending upon the type of sugarcane it actually is. Individuals who were enslaved on sugarcane plantations, they would be producing millions of dollars of worth of sugar and molasses continuously, monthly, annually, in order to make the owners billionaires. One of the best maps to look at is Norman's chart of the lower Mississippi River, sometimes referred to as Persac's map. And it shows the plethora of plantations on the lower Mississippi River on both sides of the river. And it's massive. It is an extreme number of plantations. Most of the selling happened right here along the river. So they didn't have to go to New Orleans. It may take a boat 6 hours to get to New Orleans from here, and it's only 50 miles away because they're making multiple stops. But that is one of the reasons why owners chose this river, not only for growth purposes, but for economic purposes, because that is a way of import and export. That's the way to travel. They're making sure that they can load these hogsheads up and load them onto the boats. And they can have 1,000 pounds in one hogshead. So they were doing everything they needed to do right from their own confines. Because every owner was responsible for their own levees and their own roads. This is their portion. So this is almost like their dock. On a sugarcane plantation, the life expectancy of an enslaved person is the late 20s to early 30s. For someone who was sold down south or sold down the river to Louisiana, especially to a sugarcane plantation, they would have probably been dead within about 7 to 10 years. The life is very, very harsh and very, very extreme. The weather also played a role in the crops that could grow, because again, sugarcane is an agro-industrial crop and it's a Caribbean crop, and it's grown, harvested, and cultivated all in the same location. It doesn't have to be shipped off for further processing. So that also added more income to the owners because they had to spend money to make money, but they made a large amount of money. But they needed that moist climate here in Louisiana for sugarcane, and especially for grinding season. Sugarcane cannot freeze or it'll spoil. It has to go to the mill. It has to be started the grinding process within 24 hours or it'll go bad. For sugarcane itself, the peak of the price was about $69, and that was in 1858. And so if they're producing that amount of a large amount of sugarcane, and you times the $69 per hogshead, they're going to be close to $3 billion annually just for that particular year. So the economic growth that it created for Louisiana was built off of the backs of sugarcane and cotton plantations. Now, these cabins that are here just kind of shows the depiction of what a slave cabin or even a sharecropper's cabin would have looked like. It is technically a duplex, 2 cabins on each side. It's going to have usually have a fireplace in the middle of the wall. They wouldn't have used those fireplaces very often because it does not get very cold here, but they could use that for minor cooking purposes, but most of the cooking would have been done outside as a community effort. There may be 3 to 4 living on one side, on the opposite side, 6 to 8 or more living on that side. And so they again have one mat to sleep on per household. Mostly be sleeping on the floor. So these spaces would have been very, very cramped all the time. But you see they're elevated, they're raised. That is in the Afro-Caribbean style. They would have needed that because to let the airflow go in and out of the home. That keeps it a little bit cool. As you can see, there is no shade. They wouldn't have had that shade, so they needed that airflow. But also the way the doors match is considered a shotgun home, front to back. So that also allows for the airflow to go in and out. So they would have had that little bit of breeze coming in and out of those spaces just as well.
All right, that video was a video that I completed for the Queen Sugar 101, the Learning Companion, which I actually wrote for as well. And that was videoed at St. Joseph Plantation and Felicity Plantation in St. James Parish, which is right up the river from Orleans Parish, where the group of enslaved people that Conrad and his wife had were sent to. Now, as mentioned, Dunboyne Plantation. This was a plantation in Iberville Parish that was owned by Edward George Washington Butler. And Edward George Washington Butler and the home is, of course, no longer there, but this is just a photo of what the home actually looked like from the Tulane University's collection. And as you saw in those videos, sometimes even the sharecropper home or even the homes for the enslaved, they're no longer there just as well. Now, some of those homes were still standing in say in the 1950s, even and beyond, including in Iberville Parish itself. Now, These ledgers that you're seeing here was ledgers that were titled Negroes on Dunboyne Plantation. These ledgers were uncovered from the family papers, the Butler family papers, by way of Mr. David Plater, who wrote a book. He is a descendant of the Butlers, and the book he wrote is about the Dunboynes of the Butlers of Iberville Parish. And so that list, these three images here show the enslaved persons that were on the plantation during between 1835 and 1838. There is no date associated with this, but from research, we're able to see that the dates are consistent because there are images and ledgers that look identical to this, and those do have dates on there. And so the dates of their ages and persons who died, they're all still on this same type of document. But this shows some of the persons, including the persons that were on the ship that were provided to Edward and his wife. So information like this is something that you would find in a collection database, and it's something that needs to be in a database for the enslaved people because it adds more to their story. It can add birth dates, it can add death dates, it can add information about where they were purchased, because on some of these records you see Dennis, of course, in the middle image, it shows present from Lawrence Lewis. And when he actually arrived, and the persons under there, you'll see Thomas again, and you'll see Calvert again. And this is actually one of the last times we see Calvert in one of these documents. And even though he has a very uncommon name, he hasn't been able to be located in subsequent documents so far. Now, the Parkers. As shown previously, the Parkers, they include Nellie, they include Dennis, they include Thomas, they include Calvert. And these persons were descendants of Nellie Parker, who was one of the persons who were provided to Butler and his wife. Now, Nellie was the mother of Dennis Parker. And so Dennis Parker, just a little bit of background about him, he was the body servant of Colonel Butler. And so he went along with him in the Mexican War, and is said to be the same Dennis Parker that was alongside him in the Civil War. However, with research that I've been able to conduct, it appears that though those may be two different persons of Dennis, it may be Dennis and his son, just because of the age differences and information that we're able to find on the later census records that showed such a huge gap in the ages and identification measures of both Dennis. So previous research that was provided by Dr. Cassie Good, she did an amazing job with researching a lot of these individuals before they even left Fairfax, Virginia, not these persons specifically, but others who were associated and enslaved on the property at Woodlawn Plantation. It was found that Nellie's was the daughter of Joe, who was a carpenter and a bondsman of George Washington, and Dulcie. Her name is also sometimes spelled D-O-L-S-H-E-Y. She was a house servant and a washerwoman of Martha Washington. They were both at Mount Vernon. And so to the immediate right, you'll see just the lineage of the persons associated with Nellie, and it shows her son Dennis, and it shows her actual children. So one thing that I like to point out, I know sometimes the conversation, it often shifts and gears to how families were often sold apart and families were broken up many times. But there is a ton of evidence that actually counters that shows some of these families were indeed kept together and they were sold in family groups. And so by researching all of that information, but trying to piece together who is whom and whose family, that is able to give a different argument and different perspective to say that, okay, and it's not a humane system that they kept families together, but what was the reason that they actually kept some of these families together? And so there are varying reasons why they may have done so. Now, this is a very, very important document. I know a lot of times we think about the difficulties in African-American research or Black history research, and we always get the topic of the 1870 brick wall. And I like to completely dispel the 1870 brick wall. Our history is not completely difficult. It takes a lot more skill to actually research African-American history, because we have to not only navigate through our records, but records of non-Black persons, because that's where many of our records are when it comes to enslaved people. And so there are ways to identify persons way beyond the 1870, which is through that ledger list or even through baptismal records, which I have been able to uncover some baptismal records. But most of these, I will say most of these people, they were actually not Catholic. So there is very small pieces of information that is provided. But these freedmen records are extremely important. This is, when you look at a freedman's record, this is not what a typical freedman's record would look like, but this one shows the different identifiers about some of the persons, including if someone was an invalid, or there was a house servant, or if they were crippled, or persons who were, I've seen one where someone was considered a tolerable blacksmith, meaning that his temperament was decent, or someone who is deaf. And so this is one of the agreements with the owners, and you will see that this is also still with Edward George Washington Butler of Iberville Parish in 1864. Now, with Dennis, the Dennis that assisted or went with Colonel Butler to the Mexican War, his wife was presumably a woman named Sally. Later, and we see them listed in an 1870 census with their children. However, the 1880 census shows a different wife, but a Dennis that is completely a different age than what someone who would have served within the Civil War would have been. And so the second Dennis, his wife was a woman named Susanna. And I was trying to figure out where did Susanna come from? Also listed in the Butler family papers, there was a bill of sale that showed a family group. It was a woman named Edie or Eddie, and she was considered a light colored woman, and it lists these children along with her. There's also a gentleman by the name of Ned. We have not been able to identify if Ned is her husband or the father of her children, but Edie had 2 sets of twins. So I've been looking to see if there is evidence of someone there at the Woodlawn property that's still there, or even the Mount Vernon property that had sets of twins. And so we may be able to put these families back together, but was able to find out that the seller was Dr. Absalom Remington, and he did sell those people to Colonel Butler. And this here is a copy of their bill of sale. Now, also, in the same records of the Uncas ship lists Edie or Eddie and those same children and Ned Travis. Their surname, I find, was Bunch or Punch, and those 2 names are interchangeable, and they have a very large DC, Maryland tie to the Bunch family. There are a lot of persons who can trace their ancestry to the Bunch family, and so that is where Dennis's wife would have, her actual surname would have been. Now, again, this is another freedman's record that shows what a typical freedman's record would actually have looked like. And so this record here is going to be from 1866. So when we think about freedmen, we think that everyone was just completely free and they went in various places and they just left. Well, most people actually did not. There was really nowhere for these individuals to go, not much money, and they were technically stuck in with some of the plantation owners who were previously their former enslaver. And so with these records, I do see Susanna on these records, as well as some of the same individuals that were associated with the same surname. Now, there are a few new persons with the same surname, such as Bunch and Punch. And so that's part of the ongoing research to locate and try to identify how are they related to Susanna, if they are even related to her. Now, Nellie Parker, and the name is interchangeably spelled differently in certain places. And so one of the main topic that has come about is talking about these illustrious slaves, these persons who were owned by these notable individuals. And these persons who were associated with the Butlers and the Conrads were considered part of those notable families. So this is the death notice of Nellie Parker. This is, I recently uncovered this and provided this information to Mr. Plater because he had wrote so much about Dennis, but never knew much about his mother or when she passed away. And so when she did pass away, Colonel Butler decided to put her death notice in the newspaper. And he actually put it in the newspaper 4 times because he had to get an apology from the news writers because they listed it under supply and demand, and he was not happy about that. And so he wanted it done over, and they had to profusely apologize to him for doing such because he considered her such a faithful servant and a part of the family that he wanted her obituary or death notice to be something that would be commemorated. So on this third obituary here, it talks about the notable colored woman. And she died on Dr. Charles Claymont's property. And you'll see that here in the top right. Across from it, you will see, down from it, you will see Dunboyne Plantation for Colonel Butler. And in her death notice from 1877, she is 85 years old. And it mentions how she's the laundress of the late Edward George Washington Butler. And her mother was a laundress of Mrs. Butler's mother. And her grandmother was the laundress of Martha Washington of Mount Vernon. It mentions 3 sons that she leaves and 4 daughters. Now, the previous record, one of the previous records that I showed you, it showed a list of all of those children. However, there's still 1 daughter that is missing that I have not been able to find as of yet. But her death notice mentions that she was of the last of the old Washington stock in this parish, in Iberville Parish. And like all servants of that illustrious family, she prided herself upon the descent. Now, that brings me to a questionable theory of, well, if the pride, many of the descendants that I've been able to speak to from not only this group, but several other groups that are affiliated with the Woodlawn Plantation, most of them never knew about their ancestral heritage. They never knew about their connections to Fairfax, Virginia. They never knew about their connections to Lewis or his wife, or even Georgia Martha Washington. And so that is a oral history, oral family knowledge that is completely gone. And so I'll get into a little bit of that later as we continue, because that is a question that I get. Well, if they had this heritage and this is where they come from, then why do the descendants not know of this information? All right. Going back to Lucinda, the young lady who was mentioned several times in the correspondence, and this is her writing about her death. She passed away, and you can read here on the screen the lamentations that were written about her and her passing away. But it speaks of, you'll notice that they're consistently calling them servants versus slaves or enslaved people. Of course, they would not call them enslaved, but they would call them slaves. And so it is curious to me. I'm curious as to the difference of their wanting to call them servants as opposed to slaves, because that was their legal status. But was it because they considered them parts of the family or held them to a higher status other than someone else? However, if they would have done so, then it again makes me question how they're going to be sold down to a sugarcane plantation, which in itself is a death sentence. So what kind of lifestyle did they actually have, and how much more prominent did they expect these people really to be? And this is just excerpts from the second part of Lucinda, of the letter speaking about Lucinda. Edward George Washington Butler asked his good friend, Charles Gallier, to write a suitable obituary for her because he was so distraught that he was unable to do so himself. That obituary has not been located as of yet, and hopefully it will arrive and flourish and come to existence at some point. It very well also may be in someone's family papers. So that can definitely be included into a database to show not only what she died of, because they are aware of how she passed, and just information about her life and the writings of how they're speaking about these individuals as people, as they should have always done. All right. Just kind of going back to the mentioning of Dennis Parker here. This is from the 1870, census, and it shows the Dennis Parker, age 60, with a wife, Susanna, and their children. But then it also goes into another Dennis Parker who is much, much younger. And so the biggest question is, who is Dennis? Are we having the right Dennis? Because his descendants actually have been located. The first persons to contact their descendants was Mr. Plater. And so trying to identify if the persons that we think is the same persons in the Mexican War is the same as the person in the Civil War, so we can make the determination of the original set of children that Dennis was supposed to have. Who were they and where did they actually go? All right, so with the news writings of and listings and announcements of persons associated with the president, especially George Washington, you saw that we have, of course, Nellie Parker, but there's a mentioning of a lot of different persons who were considered to be body servants of George Washington, and not all of them are, not all the information or the stories were true. So these are just some snippets of persons who consider themselves to be servants, or someone who knew George Washington themselves. And one running thing that I have learned from reading through many of these articles is these persons they lived well over 100 years. Each person that is speaking about him were well over 100 years old. One gentleman, he was 123. I don't know the accuracy of that, but all of these individuals can claim they have ties to George Washington or was his personal servant. All right. Now this person here, James Parker, he has information in the news articles that also associate him and his family with George Washington and Martha Washington. But this one is a little bit more believable. He is also in Iberville Parish, James Parker, and he was considered the great grandson of George Washington's body servant and affiliated with Martha Washington. And he married a young lady by the name of Eliza Johnson, who was the daughter of Cornelia Jackson, whose husband, you see, was Benjamin Franklin Jackson, who was a descendant of Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory. That part the latter part has not been confirmed as of yet, because there is no information as to where Eliza's parents came from. But it is very probable that James Parker is very well related to Nellie Parker and Dennis in some form or fashion. We find later that his father's name was Arthur Parker. The news speaks about their wedding in a very extensive fashion. These individuals were married at Tally Ho Plantation in Bayou Gula, which is also in Iberville Parish. And they were married by the Reverend Basil Dorsey, who Dorseyville, Louisiana, is named after. And the article, it goes on to speak about their being a prominent couple and they're having this eliteness of their wedding. And so these people were still talked about way after slavery. And so there had to be some kind of importance to them or important memory to them, to whereas their lives were still documented long after their families had already been so far removed from the Woodlawn Plantation and the Lewises and the Washingtons. All right, now group 2, this is the group that was willed to marry Eliza Angela Lewis by her father. This is the portion of the will that shows these same individuals. And again, they're not put in respective order as to how they are related, if they are related, nor their ages. They're only listed by their names. These individuals were also located on the Uncas slave ship manifest, and you see that they now have surnames. These are also two groups of families. You have the Johnson family and you have the Quander family. Let me go back to this. Okay, so I'm sure many may recognize the name. Quander is one of the most documented African-American families in the country. And they have ties to Maryland, Washington, DC, and Virginia. And so this group went to Orleans Parish. When Mary Eliza Angela Lewis passed away, she passed away very, very early, and literally almost right after her father's will. And so they provided two succession records, two property records, one in Orleans Parish and one conducted in St. Mary Parish. And the first list that you see, it shows the persons that were listed with the Orleans records. And the second was listed with the St. Mary records for Orleans Parish. And you'll see the descriptions of those individuals in this record. So it shows this is her individual estate that she came into the marriage with. Now, the missing links between the time that Mary Eliza Angela Conrad passed away and until, say, 1850, there is a huge gap because these persons are missing. There's not much information about them. We do know that Charles McGill Conrad was with the Fillmore administration, but he himself kind of skips and moves and is kind of lost between time, and it's hard to place on specific records just because he was a politician and he did a lot of work as being an attorney, but had a lot of businesses, not only owned enslaved people, but he had a lot of warehouses. However, Orleans Parish is, even though it is the most infamous slave trade port, it's a port city, there is not a lot of land for those individuals to cultivate out in Orleans Parish. And so the likelihood of those individuals being sold elsewhere away from Orleans is very high, but also it is very possible that they could have been still working in someone's house and still been enslaved. For these persons, however, for the Johnsons, the earliest they show up in the records is in 1860. And you see Marcellus Johnson and his family. They also see right under Marcellus, a few persons down, you'll see William, Susan, and Thornton. That is one family group. William and Susan are the parents. Thornton and Marcellus are two of their sons. Their third son, his name is Murray. And this is in 1860. And so usually an enslaved person would not be on a census record, especially of this type, if they were still enslaved. And so that led me to believe that these persons may have been manumitted. Now, there is no record that actually shows a court advised manumission. We're still reading through the records to locate that information to see if they did it the legal way through the court system, or if maybe it was just a verbal type of manumission. 1850, we see Murray Johnson in Jefferson Parish. I talked to an amazing friend of mine and colleague, Ms. Gaynell Banks Brady, and we were talking about Jefferson Parish as opposed to Orleans Parish. And she explained to me about the boundary line changes and then understand, okay, well, they were here in 1850, but he was now here in 1860. And so with the ways that the maps actually changed, it does show that they were almost in the same area. It's just that the land boundaries would have actually changed. Now, in the 1850 census, what really struck me was that there was a 16-year-old Irish girl living with these individuals at that time. It's very possible that she was an indentured servant. Her name was Julia Carr. This is the only time that she's been located on any of these records, and she has not been located on any subsequent records for even residing with the family or just in general. So I'm not sure if she passed away or not. But by 1860, we'll have Murray and his family again. And his children, he and his wife are not able to read or write. However, his children are able to read and write. 1860, again, Marcellus and William and Susan. Those are the Johnsons. I think I'm going backwards. Okay. Now, putting their families together. So with Marcellus Thornton and also Murray, luckily, we were able to find U.S. Freedmen's Bank records that show who their parents were, who their spouses were, their children, what they did for a living. So these two women, you'll have the Harriet Johnson, and then you also have the widow Caroline Johnson, because she's listed as a widow because Thornton did pass away. And so they list who her parents are, but also with Harry, the list who her parents, her mother and father just as well. And again, all of their children and where they resided. This is very important because some of these homes are still in existence. And for database collection purposes, it is extremely important to have that information there to show home ownership and to show how the neighborhoods changed, cities changed, and who lived where, because some of these streets may say half street. And so being able to have the old maps to show where some of these properties were is very helpful for descendants. And there are descendants who are going to be providing me a oral history interviews about the Johnson. They are descendant of Thornton Johnson. All right, adding on to the database, it is extremely important to know the full life story of an individual, and that includes how their life ended. Anyone who is trying to locate information about the deceased, there are so many avenues and so many records that one can actually pull from and pull through. I found with Orleans Parish records, many times, they do not provide their the parents' names or even the spouses' names, as opposed to other parishes later on when death certificates were required. But it still provides a lot of information and provides information about where that person resided, but also what that person passed away from. And so this is a death record for Thornton Johnson in 1874. Now, this is really amazing find for me. So the WPA, the Work Progress Administration, they went in various cemeteries and documented a lot of the burials that they were able to find. I'm sure some of them were missing as they are today, but they were paid to document these burials and the inscriptions on the tombs. And so these records are extremely invaluable. One of the reasons for this one in particular is because this is Girard Cemetery. And for those who are in Orleans Parish, you know, that cemetery, it technically no longer exists. And so the cemetery superintendent, Ms. Emily Ford, has done a wealth of research on Girard Cemetery and the people that were there, and to try to uncover maybe what happened to those individuals, the families, and who those individuals actually were. Because now that these burials are gone, a lot of this information is lost. And if they had not gone and done these indexing, then this information would be completely lost to time. So for this particular tomb is listed on the right-hand side in Alley 14, and it lists PF Society. And that is also important for database purposes, because I asked several researchers, okay, what do they think that PF Society is? It can be a typo. It can also be one of the societies that is well long gone, but finding out who were members of those societies, because that was extremely important in Black culture and African-American culture, especially in places like New Orleans, because those persons helped each other and they took care of each other, just like a benevolent society. All right, so for Susan Johnson, she also had a burial card in Girard Cemetery, and it shows that she's buried in the tomb with inscription of African Baptist Society just as well. Now, this gives an overview of the children of Murray, Marcellus, and Thornton. So if anyone recognizes any of those names or are researching any of those persons, please contact me, because I would love to speak with you to try to put more pieces of the family puzzles together, and even include images if someone actually has them. Now, the Quanders. Okay, going back to the Quanders again. The Quanders is one of the oldest Black families in the country. They started around being here around 1684. So with Lewis and his wife Eliza, sometimes written as Elizabeth, I was able to find that they were also listed on early census records. So it is presumed that they were also manumitted. And they went on to have very prominent positions within New Orleans society, one being the American Arts Association. You'll see that Mrs. L. Quanders is listed as a treasurer. She's a female marshal. And then you also have her husband, Lawrence, listed as a male officer, a treasurer just as well. But they also they participated in a meeting in Economy Hall, I found, and they helped establish the orphanage, the orphan asylum. And so that is for the Association for the Benefit of Colored Orphans, which struck me. I know a lot of work in research is done about Economy Hall. However, it took me a year or so to even go back to one of the posts that someone made. Do you recognize any of these persons? And now that I see that post that was made by Mr. Mark Radine, my apologies if I pronounced it incorrectly. They list Eliza Quanders on there. And so now I'm like, yes, okay, here is a connection. She's not my ancestor, but I can provide more information about who was sitting at that table when they were having this meeting and establishing this association. All right. So this is also another death record for Lawrence Quander himself. And he was residing on Rampart and Cleo Streets. Again, it does not provide his parents' names, but he said he died of debility. All right. So with Lawrence Quander, he has a few death cards. I'm not sure why, but each of those records have a little bit of different information. And so I'm going to be digging into more of why he has multiple records for his particular burial. So again, he's buried in Girard Cemetery, and it shows the first African Baptist Association with the Society of the City of New Orleans, organized in 1848. And so that date, that gives me a indication that I need to continue to keep going backwards to see if there are indeed any manumission papers for him, because he, at the time of the secession record for his wife in 1841, it could be anywhere between 1841 and 1850. This is a second burial card for Lawrence Quander, and you see that they misspelled the last name, but that's probably how it was still showing on the actual tomb. It may have it may have deteriorated a bit, and that's how and why they wrote it that way. And this is his third burial card. Now this one actually shows St. Joseph Cemetery, and so there were some persons who were supposed to be exhumed from the cemetery, from Girard Cemetery, and so he could have been one of those persons. That information has not been confirmed as of yet, but that is another lead just to see if his burial site still exists to this day in some form or fashion. But this is not where they exhumed the African-American people to, but it is still a starting point to see if by chance he is there or his family's there. All right, just another quick Freedmen's Bank record that shows Lawrence Quander and Eliza and both of their daughters, both who were listed with the Lawrence family. Lawrence Lewis family. Ellen Mason, she's now a Mason, and Caroline Winston. Their descendants are actively researching them. They were not aware of the Lewis and Woodlawn connection either, but they are most certainly willing to talk and have conversations and to uncover their history, because most of what they know is from Orleans on down. And this is just their information and their descendants. Again, if you are aware of anyone in these images, please contact me so we can have a conversation about descendants and kinship. All right. So with the Quander family, I am working with one of a very well-known descendant of the Quander family from the Maryland, Virginia, DC area, who has already taken a DNA test. And my goal is to find a descendant here who no longer carries the Quander surname, but is part of this Lawrence and Eliza Quander group, to test them to see if there are any ties to persons from the Mount Vernon Quanders. It is very likely that they are. That is not a typical surname, and it does not come from an actual owner. It comes from one of the enslaved, the gentleman, his name was Amquando, and they thought he was saying I'm Quando, and so that's where the Quander name comes from. And so it's going to be very interesting to try to piece together that connection. Now, I will say, doing DNA work, it can get a little bit difficult, because dealing with African-American history that has slavery involved in it, our generations pass a lot faster many times than others. And so the farther the generation, the less you may share genetic heritage with someone, and it's harder to figure out if someone is actually related, but there still are ways to actually do so. Now, so the ongoing research and the research questions that I like to focus on, of course, number one is finding proof of any manumissions, and then finding if there was a reason and what were the circumstances regarding their manumissions, other than there was nowhere for them to just work in Orleans. And I'm sure there absolutely was, but what was the reason why these individuals were listed and appeared to be free persons now, or freed persons of color, as opposed to the group that was with the butlers that remained enslaved beyond and until slavery actually ended. And of course, doing the DNA analysis and working on creating family groups of these individuals to be able to connect those who were sold here to their relatives in the Maryland, Virginia, DC area. Many times we go look for them, but there's many persons who in the North who want to look for us down here, because they know their ancestors. Some of them were sold down the river. So for preservation purposes, it is extremely important that you try to save as many records as possible. Go into these collection repositories that have these family papers, weed through them. You never know what you're going to find, because you may find names that just may be the first names. And that's really what I started with just first names. And then was the ability to put those names together and try to make a connection, and then build families, and then build those family groups. And so don't throw just everything away. Preserve as much as you can, whether that's oral family histories, whether that is documents that you think you may not need. The communities, learn more about the communities that these people were in, to learn more about their life stories and how they were living during slavery, but also after slavery, and how they may have migrated to other places, because just because these persons were sold to Iberville Parish and to Orleans Parish, some of them absolutely did not stay, and they moved elsewhere. One of the Johnson's descendants moved to New York. That's a long way going back up north. And so it's really interesting to find out that what was the reason for their move. Now, the burials, there are, with Lucinda, we do know that for a fact she was died in 1853. There have been no burial sites that have been identified as specific persons that are associated with the Dunboyne plantation, so to speak. But we do know that burials are there. We know that burials are on these plantation grounds, especially, again, these people were not Catholic, so their burials are going to be most likely around their properties. And so looking through old maps to see, okay, what are the burial spots and where these people could have actually been buried, and who was moved during the 1927 flood, or uncovering records at some of the local cemetery that are there. So talk to these people at these at the churches to see if they are aware, are the elders in the community, to see if they're aware of any persons that are knowledgeable about old burial grounds. Now, oral histories, again, is very, very important to collect the oral histories from family members, because once that information is lost, once the person passes away, it's a walking library gone. Document as much as you can. Donate what you have to repositories that can help you build and help connect other families. Now, I chose Lost Memories last on purpose, because kind of going back to, well, if these persons were associated with these so-said prominent families, why was that knowledge not passed on? Well, I think for various reasons. Number one, everyone doesn't always pass down information to their children, to their descendants. It's kind of like when you have children in the room, it's better to be seen and not heard, or you don't be around when adults are talking. But also just the memory of slavery itself is very tragic and is very traumatizing. So that is another way of not talking about it, is removing that traumatizing history. Just as well, it may have been purposefully forgotten or ignored, because I remember reading about Cujo Lewis, and he mentioned in the writing about how when the enslaved who were here were making fun of the slaves who were from Africa. And that also could have been a possibility to happen, whereas you have these enslaved persons coming from, say, the Lewis or the Washington family or the Custis family, that they're descendants of those people, and now they're here. And so they don't want to appear out of place and have any kind of backlash or discrimination while they're actually here, because things like that happen. People, are people. And so that could be very well a purposeful forgetting of those types of histories. Now, I will be taking all questions, but just really quickly, I want to give a special thank you to everyone who has been able to just provide resources to not only myself, but to everyone. Take a screenshot of these people, visit these websites, because these are some of the most amazing go-tos, not only here in Louisiana, but across the board, and can help you with so much knowledge, from the OGS to our mammies to Genealogy Adventures, National Park Service, of course, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and also Reclaiming the Records. So they do a lot of work with getting records out that normally would not be available, but they work with the Freedom of Information Act to uncover a lot of records. So if you need help with that, contact them. And this is my contact information. You can scan the QR code. And I hope I was able to provide a good enough information. Like I said, the later publishing will be coming soon, because I don't want to give out too much, but that is the information that I am able to give to you today.
All right, thank you so much, Yael. That was amazing. Learned so much. So we are going to do a Q&A until around 7:25. So if folks have questions, I see there's already a couple up there. Just submit them on the Q&A function. You'll see a button at the bottom of your screen, and you can type the question in there rather than using the chat. It just makes it a little bit easier. And so I am going to get started. So the first question that we have here, so do you recommend university libraries to see photos and learn more about slave quarters and cabins?
Absolutely. I would definitely say visit the libraries. I'm here in Baton Rouge, and so the LSU library has a very, very large collection that includes a very large collection of plantation records. And so you can go through many of those records, if there are no restrictions on them, to be able to find photos and biographies of the cabins and the sharecropper cabins in the slave quarters. But also some of the family papers that they have in those libraries, they actually hold photos itself within those particular collections, not just the library itself. But there are also a lot of books, old books that most of them do not have the cabins in there. They mostly have the plantations, but I will provide a resource. So Jason Church at the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, his work goes around and and surveys and does 3D laser scans of remaining tenant farmer homes and slave quarters. And so they preserve those homes in a digital manner so you can actually see what they may have looked like, especially in case they get torn down. But yes, definitely visit those libraries to get that information, and the state archives in Baton Rouge just as well. And the clerk of courts inside of each of the parishes. They'll have more records than pictures though.
Great. All right. So the next question is, can you provide a brief synopsis on why death certificates or records may not be 100% accurate?
Okay. So the death records are only as accurate as the person providing the information. So we look at it it's like we see census records. Census records are also be taken as a grain of salt. It's whoever's providing the information. It could be a neighbor. It can be an ex-spouse. It can be someone who has no idea who that person is. And so the information that is in the death records, an autopsy was not always done on some of these people. And so their causes of death, it may be, for instance, I've seen causes of death for babies as teething. That's not a cause of death. So doctors were still learning about things about the human body. And so they put what they thought. Just as well, someone's child may be the informant on the death record, and when they ask where's the parent born, they don't know, or who was the parent's father or mother, they don't know, or they'll list the person's step parent as a parent, and now you're thinking, oh well, this is this person's parent, and it actually wasn't, and you don't find out until a DNA test tells you otherwise. So take it as a grain of salt. Verify the information until you can no longer verify any of it.
Makes sense. So someone submitted something that's sort of a follow-up question on that. Was it a common practice for enslavers to write obituaries for their enslaved?
No, that was not common. These people, I think they were just they're not from the South. So this was just something that they were accustomed to, speaking and writing about the enslaved people that they had. And so I would say that is not a Southern hospitality thing. I would say that. And so I have not seen a ton. I have seen some, but even from persons here, but I have not seen a lot. But it's more so from families who come from a very, very wealthy background, as opposed to, say, an owner who owned 100 people. And you may think that 100 people makes the person wealthy. There are others who own 300 and 400 and 500. And some of those never even wrote anything about their enslaved persons. There's too many people to write about. But if they are going to write about somebody, I've seen it more so with their personal servants, the ones who are working in the house or are taking care of their children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So another question here, where was the Girard Cemetery and when was it destroyed? Also, you mentioned the African burial ground.
Okay, so I mentioned the African Baptist Society. So, okay, so this Girard Cemetery, it was 1957. I think so. When's the last, that's when it close. It was a lot of issues with it, and it was not sanitary, and so it was closed. And it is, if I'm not mistaken, where the Superdome parking lot in that area would have been. And so for those who were buried there, it was Protestant, and the Protestants, unlike Catholic, they did not keep a lot of records at all. So if this was a Catholic cemetery, they would have baptized an enslaved person, put their baptism, burial, birth, all in records. But these people did not. So there were so many burials that were there. And so persons who were able to exhume and get their ancestors or relatives moved, they did. Most could not, though. That is something extremely unaffordable for so many people. There is a gentleman, Mr. Hubert, I believe his name is, who wrote a book about the architecture of the cemetery. And it was more so white persons who were able to do exhumations as opposed to persons of color or Black people. But again, Miss Emily Ford would be able to provide a wealth of knowledge on that, because that's one of her major research areas. And so hopefully there is a persons who would come and say, hey, I have information about my ancestor was buried here, and provide her with that information to continue building that type of database for her.
Excellent. Wow. All right, so we have one more question up here. We still have lots of time, so if people have more
Ask
questions.
away.
The question that's up here actually right now is about the database. I'm assuming the database that we're launching and sort of celebrating today. So I might jump in on that just to give some more information.
Okay.
So the database of enslaved individuals at Hermann-Grima House, that is an initiative undertaken by Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. And we've basically digitized and made available online for free all the records that we could locate about every enslaved individual that we know of to have been enslaved on the property at Hermann-Grima House. So this is around 70 individuals. It's up on our website. Free to access. It's organized by name, so you go and you find someone's name. It's often just first names that we have, and we have information not only from our own records and archives, but various local records and archives, and we've been able to license those, so we have images of the original record, and then we also have it transcribed so that it's a lot easier to read, so you don't have to, read old-fashioned French handwriting. That's the thing that's always the barrier for me with old records, and for a lot of people. And yeah, we providing as much information as we can as a resource for historians and genealogists, as well as the general public, people trying to research their own history, really anyone. And so yeah, that's up there if you want to check it out.
If I can chime in really quickly about the database, I appreciate you all for even creating a database, because it's necessary. One of the things that I've always preached is these people have a commonality to them. They were people who were enslaved, and many of these enslavers knew each other. They knew each other. They were related to each other. And so you'll find people selling in and out, and especially in places like the river parishes of Louisiana, all of these people were related. They're working and doing business together. And so, but you have even current plantation sites that are still operating, whether they're providing tours, or whether they are set up as a museum, or whether they are set up as a bed and breakfast. There is all marketing. And so the thing that needs to be done with all of them is database. And that's one of the things that I've also been working on, in finding who these people are across the board. It's not about this place or that place. It's about the actual people and making the connections that way. The marketing and visiting part comes much later. But let's talk about how these individuals were out in fields or in homes, knowing each other, working amongst each other in the grinding season, or on the boats working together. And so that is extremely important. And if I can really quickly, I know you mentioned about weeding through some of the records, and I just wanted to show you all really quickly of just how intense record viewing can actually get sometimes. So this here is a record. This is a letter. This is considered cross-writing or cross-lettering. The everyday person is not going to be able to decipher this, but this is how they wrote. And it is to save space. It is to sometimes provide information they didn't want anyone to read. And a lot of these letters would go off, be sent, up north, down south to persons who were in the war, because they know it's going to take a long time for them to read it. I mean, sure, they knew what they were doing. We don't, because most nowadays children don't know how to read in cursive. They don't know how to write in cursive, but these people did. And so reading a letter like this, you'd have to take out a lot of time. And so when you find things like this, there are names associated inside of these letters. There are dates and information inside of the letters that can help with a lot of research. So don't get discouraged when looking at something like that. That your ancestor's name, my ancestor's name, anyone's ancestor's name may be in there, and it may give you the clue that you've been looking for. And that also should go into a database. Now, I will say, if you are able to transcribe one of those letters, please do, to make it easier for someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important. All right. I have another question here. Have you heard of any cases where the quote unquote mammy was buried with the owners?
Yes, that was buried with. Yes, I've known many cases where they were buried with. And you have
near. Sorry, I might have said with near.
Yes, yeah. So I'm sorry. Yes, so not they're not gonna, do it with the person just bury them with at that time. But yes, burying them near, because as complex as slavery is, I want everybody to keep into the mindset, these are people, and then some people do crazy things. And so the things that they thought was, this is my faithful servant, this servant loved me and trusted me. It's like how they spoke about Lucinda in that letter. And even with Lucinda, there was Butler put out, he wrote in one of his letters that there was a free man of color who wanted to marry her, and she declined because she refused to leave the Butler family. I don't know how true that was, but that's how they looked at them, as though in a paternalistic type of mentality, as though they could not survive without them. They took care of them. And so burying, when they passed away, yes, they would bury them close to the family, as opposed to someone who's just out working, someone who they may not see every single day. They had a sense of familiarity with these persons, even though it was under the oppressive nature of slavery. They would be buried, those persons. And it also means that those persons were not even able to escape them, even in death. Mm-hmm. One of the cemeteries that's close to Dunboyne Plantation is where they believe Dennis Parker to be buried, is Point Pleasant Cemetery. In front of Point Pleasant Cemetery is St. Raphael Cemetery, which other slave owners are buried there, but also free persons of color who were owned enslaved persons themselves. So it's like these people, they're buried behind there, and they could never get away from an enslaver, whether they were Black or white. They're still stuck there.
Yeah, incredibly complex. And we just recently made some big breakthroughs with our own genealogical research at the museum about some of the enslaved people and their descendants there. And one of the things that was discovered in the process was that a few formerly enslaved people and their children and their whole family tombs were actually located like right next to the family tomb. Yeah. So it's not uncommon, but the context in which the father also thought of his wife and children as a form of property treated very differently than enslaved people with a great deal more privilege, but also property. And so, understanding it that way, it does make sense that they would think about enslaved people as like the line between property and family was fuzzy already. So,
if I can just answer just one more quick question. Yeah. Well, two. Number one, I got involved in these studies as a kid. My family is part of the Bowie family. I'm part of the GU 272 family. I'm part. I have enslavers. I have enslaved people, and I have free persons of color who own enslaved people themselves. So I come from it all. And being that introverted mute kid, I had to listen and learn. And so going up to Mississippi, seeing the old plantations that my families were on or lived in, or going through Rapides Parish and going the back way through Falls River, I see these old homes, and that got me infatuated. One of my first books that I fell in love with, and as crazy as it sounds, was Sugar Petite. And I knew, okay, that's in West Baton Rouge Parish. This is, I want to find out where it was, and find out that it was a trailer park now. It's no longer in existence, but that intrigued me because seeing these places and wanting to know more about them. So I've been doing this well over, literally since a kid. But the question that the person had about an artist, I think being an artist and a painter is extremely important, because you get to paint without words, but your paint are words. And so that will help. You can bring someone's vision to life. There is a gentleman by the name of Mr. Reginald Roussel out in St. James Parish, who was born in an old slave cabin in 1959. He's a wonderful person. I've been helping him find his family history. And he was at St. Joseph Plantation. And from memory, he can draw every single slave cabin that was there. And he's not even a professional artist. This is what he does. And he can draw the aerial views, the straight views. And it is amazing. So knowledge like his is absolutely needed, because the things that are no longer there, someone needs to see that. So being an artist, being a painter, do as much as you possibly can. You know, Ms. Ruth Laney does a lot of that with the Cherie Quarters, with Ernest Gaines. And so I think being an artist, you get to speak in other ways that are not just verbal.
Yeah, very, very important to bringing sort of the creative humanity back to these stories as well.
Yes.
Well, I know you have to get running, so we're gonna call it here.
Okay.
Thank you so much for such a
Thank
fantastic
you.
presentation. I really enjoyed it, and it was so great to get to connect with you. Let's give another virtual
you.
round of applause
Thank
to
you.
Gail Gordon. And on behalf of the Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, I would like to thank Ms. Gordon for speaking with us this evening. For more information on the upcoming lectures in the Gallier Gathering series, you can visit our website, www.hgghh.org. And I would like to thank you all, audience members who logged in, for your support of our museum. We look forward to seeing you at our next Gallier Gathering. All right.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.